I'm Amanda Knox, and you're listening to Hard Knocks. On this episode of Hard Knocks, I interview Phil Klay, a great friend, former U.S. Marine Corps veteran is what they're called, and a critically acclaimed essayist and author of a number of different fictional and non-fictional works. He's so smart, so philosophical, a deeply thoughtful person who has seen the best and worst of humanity. And I think this conversation veers into a lot of trying to make sense of the bad things that not only happen to us, but that we may potentially participate in, and how we still remain, faithful to our ideals, even when we understand that we are part of a humanity that is fragile and corrupt. Enjoy. Welcome to Hard Knocks. I'm really excited to speak with you, not just because you're one of Chris's best friends, but also because you're an incredible writer about really complex, difficult topics. So for those who don't know, Phil is a U.S. Marine Corps veteran. So you've been in action. You've seen some action.
You just called me a Marine Corps veteran.
I'm really bad at military. What do we call that? How do you say that?
Corps.
Corps. Why do you not pronounce the P and the S?
Because then it would be corpse, and that would be odd.
Oh, is that no? It's not literally why it's pronounced that way, though, right?
English doesn't make sense. But
English doesn't make sense.
I'm guessing it comes from the French, and the French just like to put letters at the end of words.
True.
That you don't say for some reason.
Notional letters. Okay. You're also an acclaimed essayist and author, and you write a lot about being about the military and about war and about being a person who came home from war. And I want to talk about that. And maybe this is is there any way to very quickly assess or describe what your deployment was like and how it shaped you as a person?
Quickly, yeah. The funny thing is, look, my deployment was actually quite easy and in many ways a positive experience. I was a staff officer. I went to a very violent place and did a very safe job, right? I went outside the wire. I'd go on a patrol with infantry guys or whatever every once in a while. But for the most part, I had a relatively safe deployment in a place where there was a lot of violence, right? I went to Iraq in January of 2007. There was a very controversial change in policy where you had a surge of troops into Iraq at the time. The place where I was kind of the heart of the Sunni insurgency. There was a suicide truck bomb outside our main gate in the first month. We're sort of just there, and I'm carrying a stretcher with a small child riddled with shrapnel who's got injuries such as I've never seen before. Bombs do fairly significant things to human bodies. And during the course of that deployment, the violence went down dramatically in Anbar province. And so by the end of the deployment, I felt as though the policy that was very politically contentious had been the correct one, that we had succeeded in making things better, that we were winning the war, right? A lot of people felt that way. And that was so dependent on where you were and when you were. I remember there was a National Guard unit that had been there 16 months, and they left sort of early, mid 2007, and they left feeling unbelievably bleak about their experience and what they'd done. I remember they did a kind of video town hall back to their family back home because they're National Guard, so they're all from this one area. And I remember the guys talking to each other before they went on screen, what are we going to tell the families back home? What lies are we going to tell them? Because we can't tell the truth, And then the discussion broke out we'll save the truth for when we get home, and then will we ever tell them the truth when we get home, right? And then the unit that came in and replaced them was we're winning, because violence had really started to decline. So I left feeling very good about everything and the policy. And then, I get out of the military. I have friends who are going over to Afghanistan, and I sort of think like, oh, we did this policy in Iraq, and it was very successful. And, we're going to send guys to Afghanistan. It's going to be very, very successful. And very quickly, what starts happening is, one thing, people that I know get shot or blown up, or in one case killed, and the policy does not seem like it's very successful. And Iraq starts unraveling, and ISIS emerges in precisely those towns and cities that I thought we had got under control, and just waged this unimaginable campaign of brutality and violence. And so, 10 years after I got out of the military, I'm back in Iraq with the UN on this little tour, speaking to a woman whose whole family, except for her mother who escaped, had been murdered by ISIS, and then she'd been taken as a slave, right? And is telling me about how she escaped, right? And I'm just sort of thinking about everything that had happened in that region since I had left, feeling so good about it.
Yeah. So it sounds like the journey of adjusting back to civilian life does not come without, ghosts that haunt you long after.
Well, and also that events can radically reshape and reframe your understanding of what you lived through, right? I had a very early man in his early 20s sense of the world, and how amenable the world was to my will and what I'd like to see happen, right? And then events have really changed, and that, I think, for especially with wars that have gone on this long, I think that's a very common experience for a lot of veterans. Guys who served in Afghanistan. In 2010, I remember when Kabul fell. This one vet was like, man, he's like, I knew this was BS when I, by the end of my deployment, I knew this was a mess, and I knew that this was a war headed to failure. I thought I'd come to grips with that, right? And then Kabul fell, and it was just like this crushing thing all over. And then, of course, he's trying to help get Afghans out, and that was its own added complication and horror.
Right. So does that make you feel more ambiguous about your experience, or how does that impact you personally?
Well, the entirety of my life has been writing about American war and military policy and veterans issues, and trying to make sense of it, and kind of going between thinking about what that means personally and what that means about us as a country, and also just arguing things that I think we should do. So it's become the driving passion of my life to grapple with the subject in a kind of hopefully morally serious way.
Can you explain to me what you write about something called moral injury, that you call moral injury? How do you explain that to someone who hasn't served in the military?
Right. So I think people are very, comfortable with the idea of trauma, right? And post-traumatic stress disorder, it's like a wound, right? A wound to the mind, but fundamentally a wound, right? And moral injury encompasses the moral dimension of that, right? That you can have an experience which is kind of horrible and painful and frightening and traumatic. And that's one type of thing that a person can suffer, right? But when there is an added sense of betrayal, that pushes the injury into a realm that includes sort of moral and spiritual dimensions, right? If you feel that, I remember when ISIS rose in Anbar province, I was at a documentary screening, right? And there's a Q&A with the filmmaker afterwards, and it was a documentary about Iraq. And this vet stood up. It's this big guy, he must have been like the perfect image of a Marine in dress blues, and he said, I was a Marine sergeant in Iraq. That's something I used to be proud of, really proud of. If you'd asked me to make a resume of my life, not a resume for a job, but just like an accounting of who I was, what I was, all the bullet points would have been, Marine sergeant, led Marines in Iraq, combat veteran. But now I'm looking at Iraq and I'm wondering what I was a part of. And I'm wondering if I was a part of an evil thing. And if I was, then I don't know who I am anymore.
Right.
And so there's a psychologist, Judith Herman, who wrote a book about trauma and recovery. And she says that extreme trauma can force someone, I forget the exact language, but it's like you need to become your own judge, philosopher, and theologian, right? Because extreme trauma is often an encounter with human evil, right? And so it often reshapes your sense of the rules that men and women live by, of the sort of moral code, and also of the cosmos, right? I remember giving a talk, and a veteran asked a question to me. He said, I'm a veteran of Afghanistan, and after I came back, I stopped believing in God because it made it easier. Because it meant that there were questions I didn't have to ask. Right? So that is something that can't simply be spoken of in terms of injury, right? The same way you would talk about like a broken leg, right? That's something that is much deeper and provokes pushes us to ask more fundamental questions about human beings and human society.
Do you think an element of that is particular to the military experience because there's this element of signing up for what you believe to be a grander project, and like your identity sort of becomes wrapped up in that choice, as opposed to like as opposed to some other injury, like just some natural disaster that happens or whatever it may be. Like no one signs up to be wrongly convicted or in a natural disaster, but you sign up to be a part of the military project with this idea that it has this grander purpose, and that's where that sense of betrayal and moral injury is coming from also?
Yeah, there's an idealistic component for why a lot of people join the military. Also, like, there's a whole host of reasons that people join the military, but that's usually some piece of it. And yes, it's a collective effort, and it's one where you have a limited amount of control over what you end up doing. I know a guy who protested the war in Iraq and then joined the army because he thought that, how he behaved overseas would have a huge difference in terms of human lives. And he felt like he wanted to do his part, and then he got sent to Afghanistan twice. I know another guy who joined the army, and he was looking at two different deployments. They were either going to send him to West Africa to deal with help deal with an Ebola outbreak, right? Which is a mission that everybody could feel really good about. If you went and if you did that mission and came back, everybody would say, good on you,
Yeah, Ebola's bad.
Way to go against Ebola. His other possible deployment was to be a military policeman at Guantanamo Bay, right?
Whew.
And those are radically different moral propositions, and certainly you would get a radically different response from people when you came back and told them about what you'd done. And yet whether he was going to do one or the other was entirely a decision that was out of his hands.
Wow.
And also, and this sort of adds to the complication, the reason that he might have been going to fight Ebola is because collectively, all of us American citizens have, decided that that's the kind of nation that we're going to be, that we might do that from time to time and help with Ebola outbreaks. And that's a good thing about America. But also, all of us as American citizens, are citizens of a country that tortured people and sent them to Guantanamo Bay, right? And that's part of who we are as a country. And then he will end up either being sort of the most directly implicated in one of those two things, but it's a result of a kind of collective responsibility that we all have.
Do you feel like that's one of the things that is most misunderstood by civilians? That, what is misunderstood about this whole experience by civilians? I'm sure there's you could give a big list of things, but
I mean, I think certainly one thing that is difficult for veterans and it can curdle is this sense that there's a thing that we all decided to do as a country, and then the veteran is the one who ends up caring about it even after everybody else has moved on, right? I certainly see some of that frustration with, guys who are working to try and bring, Afghans who served in the special forces or served as interpreters or served with American troops or worked with Americans and somehow in their lives are at risk. And they're like, we got to get these people out. And yeah, you say that to your average American, they might sort of assent, but most people don't care. It's not, top 50 issues in American life to most folks. And that means, especially in the current sort of political climate, nothing's going to happen, right? And, that means actual people who get condemned as a result of that. And that can feel really, really harsh. The problem is I think there's also a thing that happens where I remember there's a memoir by a Vietnam vet who's talking about when he first came back from Vietnam, he just could not, walking down the street, he couldn't get it into his head how it could be possible that people could be walking around caring about their jobs or their careers, the next piece of ass, and not Vietnam, right? This dark star that he was circling, right? But of course, they're caring about other things, and some of those things are really important, right? It's America's a big, complex country with a lot of morally significant issues, and people living their basic, normal civilian lives is an important and valuable thing in and of itself. That's why you sign up to defend the country, theoretically, because you value normal, oblivious American life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you can have this sort of sense where people, military members will kind of have a chip on their shoulder or feel superior to, people who served. Rob O'Neill is the Navy SEAL who took credit for killing Osama bin Laden. And sometimes tweet things like when political events don't go his way, I can't believe I, signed up to defend you people. It's if you have no respect for American citizens,
yeah, okay.
What were you really defending? But yeah, that you can get that kind of that kind of justified frustration can sometimes curdle as well, and I think it's difficult to keep in balance, right? Anybody who's encountered with anything extreme, it's how do other people not understand the significance of this issue that really matters to me?
Yeah.
Right? I
hear that.
You talk about criminal justice reform, and it's
Yep.
if we don't do this, it means horror for lots of innocent people, right? And people be like, oh, that's interesting. False confessions. Wow, how psychologically interesting that you can, police can induce a false confession. But it's not like we need to institute reforms because right now there are real people whose lives are being destroyed unjustly. That if we change this policy issue, that wouldn't happen.
Right.
And yet, everybody has their own, their own circle of kind of moral concern.
So how do you think that veterans cope with that disconnect? Because I see you coping with it by writing about it endlessly. So good on you. But I don't think everyone
is that
does
a healthy
that.
way to do it? I don't know.
I think that's very healthy, Phil. It's very healthy. But how do you see, you write about the stories of other veterans and how they are coping with these, both psychological and moral injuries. How do you see them coping and not coping with them?
I mean, so one of the things probably important to say is a large part of this is not about any idea that you have, right? Or some sort of realization, so much as it is like people transition out of the military and develop a new community, right? That offers them a kind of rich private life, right? And a rich network of, a community, right? So I think that the kinds of communities that people integrate back into are probably more important than any one kind of idea that people might have. But there are folks for whom, as I mentioned, oftentimes joining the military involves some degree of idealism, right? And particularly when you have a sort of idealism that has been thwarted or complicated by events, as I talked about at the beginning, that doesn't remove that desire for service, right? So you do have a lot of vets that I know who have become involved in a variety of nonprofits, in community work, and so on. Actually, I think veterans are statistically more likely to be involved in community organizations, more likely to vote, more likely to be involved in some degree, some kind of civic, participation, where they continue or find a new way to fulfill that desire to be of service, right? And that's certainly a part of it. And then, when they do that, then they find a community. And I've encountered a variety of veterans, everything from sort of people involved in political advocacy, right, to disaster relief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's funny. It sounds like because you're talking about betrayal, right? You're talking about you had this goal to serve this greater purpose as a part of this institution, and it's like that institution set you up, but it's not necessarily the institutionalness of it that you feel betrayed by, because you might want to be a part of a new institution that is solely dedicated, for example, to disaster relief. It's almost like getting to pick and choose the deployment instead of just being at the whim of the greater military complex deciding what it is, how you're serving.
I don't feel betrayed by the Marine Corps, right? It's not the Marine Corps didn't decide. The Marine Corps, yeah. The Marine Corps didn't decide to, invade Iraq, right?
So what do you feel betrayed by? What do veterans feel betrayed by?
I can speak to myself personally, right? I do have, first off, I feel like we have failed to have serious military policy for a long, long time, right? I have, at some point, written at least one, if not many, extremely angry op-eds or essays about the military policy or some aspect of the military policy of every president that I've ever written under, right, of both parties. I've had many, many complaints, we'll put it that way. So there's that level of failure, right? A failure of leadership when it comes to everything from Congress doing its job in terms of oversight to the decisions that our presidents have made, right? So that is a real failure. And I think that for a long time, the American public has not treated military policy with much seriousness, right? I think that it is a scandal that someone as unqualified as Pete Hegseth is the Secretary of Defense, right? And I don't say that in terms of his politics, right? There have been Republican and Democratic Secretaries of Defense, which you can criticize, but who have been, reasonable picks, right? That's not a serious pick from a country that is treating military matters as matters of life and death, right? For the people under that person's command, right? And so there's a sort of deeper issue, though, which is, so there's, a certain degree of competence, right, that we might expect or demand that we haven't gotten. And then there's also the sort of question of idealism, right? I joined the military because I'm a patriot, right? Because I love the country. There are things that I feel very passionately about in terms of what it is that makes America a distinctive nation. And I think there are areas where we have really failed to live up to what America can be, and where we sort of turned our backs on certain types of American ideals. It's really quite enraging to me that Afghans who proved themselves in war alongside Americans can find themselves at risk and stranded when, we've shut down every, we're limiting every kind of refugee unless you're like a white South African, right? Who's under nowhere, like the idea to compare the level of threat between something like that and an Afghan is a joke, right? And I think that there's a way in which, in recent times, we launched these wars with a certain amount of like very bombastic American rhetoric, and they were disastrous in many ways. And I feel like, in the recent political climate, we have turned our backs on a lot of that sort of idealism, right? J.D. Vance, who's a Marine veteran like myself, was in public affairs just like myself. His convention speech was like, abstractions are nice, but, nobody fights for an abstraction, right? They'll fight for their country. It's like, well, no, like Americans have fought for abstractions. And not just for land, right? And one of the most eloquent American statesmen to ever talk about that was Abraham Lincoln, who knew something about war.
What does that make you think about idealism? Do you think that people are naive to enter into the military because of idealistic notions? Like, do you feel jaded?
No. I think that, look, my idealism has taken, a few dings, but I think that's a healthy thing, right? I think that, look, you always have to fight for the country that you want your country to be. And the reality of the country is never going to match the rhetoric, right? To advocate for American ideals from the beginning has involved a certain amount of shamelessness, right?
Okay,
you go
fair.
you go to the Jefferson Memorial, right? And you look in Washington, D.C., and you look at, these like amazing statements from Jefferson about freedom and slavery, right? And you're like, this is incredibly inspiring. What a shameless,
Yeah.
in many ways, kind of awful person. I mean, like, he enslaved his own children, right? And yet it's a very good thing for the cause of human freedom that he said those words so shamelessly. I think you have to fight, and I think you have to have a tempered idealism, right? There's a Derek Walcott in his Nobel speech says, you break a vase, and the love that reassembles the shattered parts is stronger than the love that took the vase's symmetry for granted when it was whole. And I think that a mature patriotism, right, does not sort of see the failures of grand abstract rhetoric or the hypocrisies of it and then goes, oh, I guess we don't believe in abstractions anymore, and we'll only fight for land and blood. It goes about with a sense of human weakness, frailty, corruption, hypocrisy, but also of the value of human beings and the importance of the ideals that affirm human dignity and freedom, and which are ideals that are affirmed by the basic documents of American democracy, and that are affirmed repeatedly throughout our history, and as well as violated. Right? It's about finding the tradition that you want to grow and sustain, rather than just kind of like adopting a comfortably cynical perspective that allows you to risk little, but gain nothing.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, do you think that kind of mature idealism translates outside of like the military project? Do you?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is the question that we're all facing as like, what does it mean to be an American, right? That is a question that is in dispute right now, right? And it is in dispute because of deep, deep failures in America, not just in terms of military policy, right? But the American political, military, economic, and cultural life has been in turmoil, right? And there have been deep, deep failures at the elite level, right? And so we're sort of asking ourselves once again, like, what kind of country are we, right? What kind of country do we want to be?
Is there coming back? Because I'm hearing more and more, maybe this is because of where I live, but it seems to be more and more people around me or just in the ether are expressing this notion of burn it all down.
Hmm. Yeah.
which is horrifying to me, the idea of just burning, like, but like, are you hearing that? And what does that even mean? And are we just in growing pains? Our country is still pretty young compared to other countries. Like, is this just our awkward adolescent phase that we have to get through? Or are we about, like, where are we and how do we mature out of this moment?
Look, we've had these cycles before, right? I think that, you know, in many ways, you go through American history and you see moments of kind of very idealistic and open conception of America alternate with a rigid and often violently enforced, more kind of racially and ethnically demarcated notion of what America is and should be, right? You know, you look at the First World War, and there's all this sort of, you have sort of mass immigration, all this grand talk about the Americanization of all these people who are coming over, and then and you have, like the melting pot division, and some of the most storied examples of heroism come from that division, a division of recent immigrants speaking dozens of languages, and then after World War I, you have the Red Summer, you have the targeted lynching of black veterans, you have the first racial quota laws in America that are instituted. I think these are sort of cycles of sort of progress and reaction that you have perpetually throughout American history, because what it is to be an American is always something that's under dispute, right? It's a people, and it's a land, and it's a culture, and it's also an idea and an ideal, and a contested idea
Mm-hmm.
that, because that idea includes a certain amount of openness and diversity, right, means that American identity is always in flux and always changing.
So, how does faith play a role in this? You're a man of faith, but faith in what? Faith in
Well,
what, my friend?
I'm a Catholic, so yeah, faith in God. I think that there is a way in which, what I'm talking about is, projection towards the future, right? It's, you look back in American history, right? If you to go back to sort of just a discussion of patriotism and those sorts of things, you look back at American history and you find certain resources, but you don't find a kind of pure, untroubled past that we can go back to, right? You find change, political and sometimes actual combat, and moments of hope and moments of unbelievable despair, and then you try and sort of take up what resources you have from the past and from the present, and try and project a future that looks a little bit more like the best version of those things. And that does require a certain amount of faith. It requires a certain amount of faith in the possibilities of the country and in your fellow countrymen, right? Which can sometimes be hard to feel when you're at your lowest, right? When you're at your angriest, and there are things that this country does that make people justifiably incredibly angry. Faith in God is actually, I think, helpful for this, because at the end of the day, I don't think that everything rests on the turning of history, right? And, it is funny. I do think there's a way in which one of the problems of like modern politics is it feels like everybody is like a political strategist, Um, so, everybody is trying to win the argument without necessarily believing in the words that they use to win it, or trying to figure out, what will play best, or what have you. And I think whether it's a faith in God or just some sort of internal reserve, right? It's not exclusive to religious people. It's a sense that, like, actually, no, like the important thing is not winning the kind of utilitarian contest of the day, right? But rather preserving some sort of interior space that's sacred, right? Which I think allows you to be a little bit more honest. At least I try to be. Say what you believe and live up to, those virtues that you believe in, even if it's not entirely clear that doing so will win the day for your cause, or,
I mean, isn't the Catholic faith a little bit like, deep down it's going to win the day? Because, I mean, I'm reminded of something that my Catholic priest friend would tell me in prison, where he would say, like, whether or not you win or lose in court, like, it's all going to be for the good, because this is, God's got it under control. And so,
I think one thing would be, in the city of God, Augustine talks about, like, the city of God and the city of man. The city of man is driven by lust for power, right? And that's always going to be there. And it's not that you throw up your hands and don't engage in politics, right? Political contestation over issues you think are of utmost importance. But you also don't think that the battle's ever going to be won, right? Because we're human beings, and you only look. I think you only really achieve lasting things in society by joining with other people, by putting your shoulder to the wheel, joining with organizations, understanding yourself not just as like one lone isolate individual, but as somebody with a responsibility to the mass, right? And trying to be a part of something bigger than yourself. And the second that you do that, you become part of an institution that's going to be corrupt, right? Because it's filled with human beings. And it's not that that's like okay, but it's our condition, right? And you navigate it as best as you can. And I think that's the, human frailty. Understanding that is always going to be a part of it, but sort of having a sense of mercy when you think about both yourself and others in regards to that can be essential, because otherwise I think it's too easy to slip into sort of despair or rage or self-righteousness, right?
When you see former veterans or even just friends who are slipping into states of despair or rage or cynicism, what do you tell them?
Well, it depends on the person. I'll tell you something. I'll tell you a story.
Okay, let's hear it.
So I've mentioned before, Afghans, and people working with Afghans. And I think it's difficult to effectively underscore how intense this work can be. I mean, you probably have a sense of it because criminal justice involves similar stakes. But, I remember talking to a veteran, and he'd been on the phone with this woman who was on a Taliban death list, and she'd been like severely beaten, was in the hospital under a fake name with like a tube in her stomach being hidden by doctor friends of hers. And he's, a volunteer trying to help people get their paperwork ready so they can actually get out of Afghanistan. And what she doesn't really understand, like in her mind, like he's America, like he's got a red, white, and blue Black Hawk that he can send to pick her up. And he's just not doing it. And at one point she asks him, like, why are our lives not worth saving? Right. And, I know somebody else who's working with these like women activists for women's rights, right? And like what happened when the people they were working with were picked up and tortured. And there's a way in which people can run themselves to complete exhaustion, right? And the sense that nothing that I do is good enough. And on the one hand, it's because it's not, like they can't save people. The work that they're doing is useful and good, and they've done more good in their lives for people than most people ever will. But nonetheless, there's a sense of inadequacy. And so I sometimes tell the story of Saint Pachomius the Great, right, who set up an early monastic community. It's like the very beginning of monasticism in Egypt. And there was one hermit who felt unworthy, right? And so he was like always trying to work himself just brutally hard. And the way the story goes is he's working and working and working for the community. He works so hard his hands bleed. And Pachomius comes to him and he sees his bleeding hands and he says, "Don't you know God is merciful?" And the hermit wept for a year. And when he finished weeping, he was the one to whom Pachomius sent other hermits full of worry. I think that a sense of mercy is deeply important, including for yourself.
Where can people follow you and hear more about your writing and thinking and torturing of yourself?
So I've written 2 works of fiction, Redeployment, which is about Iraq, and a novel, Missionaries, which takes place in Colombia, mostly, but also Iraq. Afghanistan actually ends bombing Yemen, a perennially timely subject. And I have a book of essays called Uncertain Ground. I'm on Twitter. So philklay.com. I sometimes update that website. I need to update it again. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for hanging out and chatting. Is there anything else you want to say before I let you go?
Just wonderful chatting with you. Congrats on everything. Congrats on the show, the book. Fantastic stuff. So very exciting.
Yeah. Thanks, man.